to try and avoid the sort of BBC voice formality. It's something that happens when you press record. All of a sudden, you sort of turn into a
At
BBC.
the third stroke, it will be 12 o'clock precisely.
I guess for people watching, how would you describe, first of all, your own sort of ethnic background? So some people might not be aware.
Yeah, so I describe myself as African Caribbean. I'm sort of Black British. My father was born in what was then British Honduras, which is a West Indian island stuck to the mainland in the Caribbean, so next to Guatemala, below Mexico. Logging, plantation, sort of genesis, populated out of Jamaica. He came to the UK as part of the sort of call to arms during the Second World War. He joined the RAF, flew over Britain in sort of night fighting duties, and then stayed within that sort of area in the telecommunications market. I was born in London. My mother was sort of English-Irish, so as with many of us, we're sort of mixed in that regard, and grew up in I didn't grow up in London, but on the South Coast in sort of very white areas. And had the usual experience of being the odd one out.
We'll shortly come on to talking about your own successes, because I think typically in these conversations one can end up focusing on negative experiences, but I like to sort of go to two places: one, talking about your own contributions, but also your views on sort of Black History Month more generally. That said, I do want to start on, just give us a brief window into what was it like growing up. So you said the South Coast. You talked about feeling sort of the odd one out. Just give us a little bit of a snippet into what that was like.
Well, this is the 60s and 70s. So a couple of anecdotes. I had the great honor, because of working for DreamWorks, to actually meet Sidney Poitier, who, for those of you who don't know, was one of the first sort of major black faces in film to serve with love. That film had a profound effect on me because it was the first time I'd actually seen somebody who looked like my dad staring back at me from the screen.
Wow.
So I actually got the opportunity to tell him that, he's like 80, 90 something or other, but he's always been my hero. So that was a fantastic experience. Negative. I know nothing about my mother's side of the family, because as a white woman in the 1950s, she was completely excommunicated from her family. So I met her sister at her funeral for the first time and the last time, and the rest of the family is obscure. You had difficulty, going around people's houses. People would sort of say, "Oh, don't come in because my dad," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this is very real for those of us of a certain age. And also just the impact of seeing your parents sort of somewhat suppressed and unfulfilled, gives you that sense of what do you need to do to succeed.
I couldn't imagine what it would be like growing up not having had any connection with your mum's side of the family. I mean, gosh, that must have been, must have been pretty tough.
Well, you're a child. It's just normal. You meet who you meet, but looking back, it's quite stark. And just from her experience, the sense of isolation and so on and so forth. The willpower to basically, go through with that, I think has also got to be acknowledged. So it's tough for everybody.
What have been some of the successes that you've been most proud of? Some of the highlights.
Yeah, well, obviously, I was an academic, so I was able to be relatively strong academically. In a comprehensive school back in the day, remember, universities were only for sort of 15-16% of the population in the UK at that time. So being able to go to university, get very good A levels, do science, all of these things were milestones. I think going through that, really ending up as a professor at Oxford really crowned it all. Just being there, wearing the gown, being in front of the students. My one sort of sanity check was I made sure I still lived in Brixton, just to
You gotta be down with the kids, Lincoln. You gotta be down with
just
the
at the
kids.
end of the week to say, who the hell am I? And where
That must have been quite the contrast, right? Yeah, yeah.
it was a beautiful contrast. I really enjoyed that
Brixton,
that
South
dual
London,
persona.
for people who don't know, it's
Yeah,
the urban.
it's a traditionally sort of African Caribbean area of London.
Given that we're in the month of October and we're talking about Black History Month, which of course, as we said earlier, would be in February in America and Canada. I want to get your thoughts on the idea of Black History Month. Do you think it's important? How do you see it?
It's a good thing to have happening because it's you need to concentrate communication and information to break through the noise. There's so much going on in people's lives that you need some sort of concentrated way of actually registering information that they might not know. And
Yeah.
if somebody learns something during that month, that's great. It's not enough. I think that may be the criticism, that it's not enough. It really needs to be every day, but it has to be somewhere in order to change the prevailing environment.
I agree, and I think that there's one sort of argument that you sometimes hear where people will say, well, isn't that idea of focusing on a particular group an inequitable or sort of not really a sort of equalizing sort of thing? And I think that the answer is, well, there are groups of people who historically, as you said, have been forgotten about or sort of marginalized, and actually one of the equitable things you can do is sort of raising the profile of those groups and of those people, and we can.
I think that's right. Yes, but there are great dangers in this, and I think we see that today. That and it comes down to the question of groups, right? I mean, it's actually easy to identify racial groups or immigrant groups and to amplify the need to understand people from those backgrounds. But by doing so, not everybody with that background, has the same experience. There are other categorizations, and I think poverty, social structures, and so on and so forth. So in both the UK and the US, failure to recognize that there are groups of people, predominantly, Caucasian from a racial point of view, but whose experiences are very different from, the average, are very underserviced, are forgotten, if you like, actually leads to situations that we see all around us, because they're a group as well. They may be, racially privileged in some respect because of the structures that are in place, but they sure as hell don't feel that way. And failure to acknowledge that, and failure to actually amplify the difficulties of different aspects or different groupings of society can lead to a lot of trouble. So and isn't fair, really. So I think diversity needs, if it's going to mean anything, it needs to mean diversity. It's not just a racial thing. It's not just a sexual thing. It's not just an economic thing. It's also ways of thinking, ways of working, ways of behaving, all of these things, ways of dressing. Introverts, extroverts, ways of being.
I think you're quite right, and I think that's where I sort of, there are two sides to the coin. There's what I hear you describing, which is about difference in general, how we relate to difference, how we embrace difference, and then I think there's the sort of equality piece, as far as I mentioned, groups that have historically been marginalized. So here's an example. I remember coming home, my daughter coming home from school one day and saying, hey, Daddy, why can't I be white? And I remember sort of pausing, thinking, wow, what do I do with that? What does anyone do with that? And of course, I proceeded to have the conversation about, the goodness, inherent goodness, of not just being black, but being white, whatever sort of your skin tone might be. But I think, for me, that was a reminder of, to your point, about the value of focusing on a particular history, or particularly in terms of Black History Month, the value of trying to cut through the noise. Because for someone like my daughter, you know, it's important that she hears empowering and positive messages about people that look like her, like who it was Sidney Poitier for you, and for her it might be someone else. But you're right, we need to get that balance, I think, between doing that on the one hand, making sure that we look at inclusion within the diverse community, across different groups.
Yeah, and there's no one right way here. It's all different. It's poking at the beast in different ways. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, I'd interpret your daughter's question as, why do I need to be different? Why can't I be the same? And that's sort of a reflection of what's being projected is this is in and this is not in, and she's seeing that difference and saying, well, why am I not in? And to some extent, you turn that around. It's like, well, because people don't react to you in the same way because of how you look, and that's a problem. You know, you're just as much in as a white person. What does it mean? You can't have that conversation with a child, but that's effectively what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of the emphasis on diversity is about, can we not do that, please? You know, can we accept that people are very different and meet them where they are and how they are, and embrace that? And that's a good message. And sometimes to get that message across, you have to point out that, well, we're all like this and we're not like that. And that's what creates that divide. And you get, you know, emphasis of certain groups at certain times in history is more important than others. And you know, it's a continual cycle. You know, representation is important. So you expect leaders to look at the systems and structures that are maybe inhibiting that. Then just workforce, you know, diversity. So for example, again, not to emphasize this, it's just to say this is what a leader does. So what I did in looking at our engineering staff was, well, where are we recruiting from? And so then you go into the what are the considerations in terms of top high quality. How are we constructing those notions? No, not surprisingly, we construct those notions based on who we are. And if we're predominantly, you know, an Oxbridge-based organization, you tend to take the Russell Group and you say, okay, well, people coming from these universities are obviously better. Well, actually not obviously better.
Exactly.
And so one structural thing to do is to basically say, no, there's inherent bias in those systems. Our recruitment needs to be deliberately more diverse because there are excellent people in all sorts of places. So I think that's what you should expect leaders to do. And it's really operate on the systems. You know, how do we recruit? How do we create shortlists and so on and so forth, and hold leaders to account on the outcomes? You shouldn't necessarily expect leaders to be, you know, holding a flag and sort of leading in this area. I think people in the business, individuals such as yourselves, you know, individual employees, can be leaders in this area because of their experience, just as much as our organizational leaders can. I'm not trying to say we're not responsible.
No,
we're responsible for those structural things and fixing them and making them as fair and as open as possible. That's what you should hold leaders to account for.
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right, and just what I'd add to that, because I think you've described the sort of institutional level. I think there's a sort of a interpersonal and an internal sort of lens to this, which is, you know, leaders, you know, taking the moment to educate themselves. I know this is something that Herman does a lot himself, reading, and leaders just taking the time to sort of stay abreast of what's going on. And I don't think that itself is a massive ask, but I think it can, you know, be quite inspirational for junior employees to see that leaders are sort of reading into these topics and trying to educate themselves as well, in addition to the very sort of good things that you mentioned as well. Thanks so much, Lincoln. We'll put this on Slack and share this on the wiki. I'm sure people will have lots of questions. And I'm
great. Well, my door's always open. You know, I do. Talking about personal stuff is not that necessarily that comfortable, but it is. I'm glad there's a lot. Yeah. I do. I'm happy to do it if people want to dig in or find common cause.
Thanks, Lincoln.
Take care.